Section 2. Reasons for discrepancy between numbers of aircraft produced and operational strength of Luftwaffe. Question. Did the production provide the Luftwaffe with all the aircraft which it needed for operational purposes? Production records indicate fairly large quantities of aircraft, while the aircraft in operation is a much lower figure. Answer. As long as we had enough fuel, there was no particular difference. Question. When did you first cut the use of planes operationally because of shortage of gasoline? Answer. To quite an extent already in June 1944, when we finally managed to get the bugs out of the HE-177, which gave us a little trouble. This aircraft was put into operation on the Russian front after it had been used against England. I had to ground that aircraft because it consumed too much gasoline and we just didn't have enough for it. Question. Normally, how long did it take for a plane to be ready operationally after delivered by the plant to the Luftwaffe? Answer. After it was finished in the factory, there was only the question of slow timing it. After this was completed, it was immediately put on the way to the group, namely by the ferrying squadrons. Towards the last, when the need increased, the aircraft was ferried by the combat pilots themselves. Question. Did any of these planes have to go through a modification center? Answer. We had those in order not to disturb the current production. A number of changes were agreed on and these were not accomplished in the factory, but rather in the modification center. Question. How long did the airplane stay there? Answer. That varied according to how many changes were necessary and how heavily the modification center was taxed. There were cases when too many machines would pile up and that slowed down the modifications. It also depended on the weather because during the bad spells, the modified aircraft were not able to take off, which again caused the modification centers to fill up. Later, we tried to cut these modifications to a minimum and to deliver them to the Air Force already completed. Question. In 1944, did you send planes directly from the factory to the front instead of to a modification center? Answer. Not necessarily, but only when there was very little to change on them. It happened later that we distributed the machines directly to air divisions. Sometimes it happened that a wing would be up to its strength as far as pilots were concerned, but lacking in aircraft. While at the same time, something big was expected in their sector. In a case like that, we would send aircraft to the front directly, bypassing the air division. Question. What percentage of the, say, 30,000 odd planes built in 1944 went into actual operation? Answer. Our losses at that time were very heavy, so that, generally speaking, all of these fighters were used in operations. The consumption and the losses of aircraft were very heavy, so that only during the winter months was it possible to build up the reserve, thanks to the decrease in the numbers of sorties. At one time, we had increased the operational aircraft from 2,500 to 6,000 fighters, and I would like to mention that this was the highest point of all. This amount was reached approximately in January 1945. If their availability was good, it came up to 75% of operational aircraft. During the bad spells, it went down to 50%. In other words, we had 30,000 machines produced in 1944, out of which, on the average, 2,400 to 2,600 were produced each month. This number is in fighters, fighter bombers, and light bombers. I do not include other bombers and transport aircraft because we were not able to use them anymore. These operational aircraft were divided amongst all the theaters of operation. Question. What is the greatest number of operational planes you ever had at any one time? Answer. On all fronts? That's hard to say. I only know the exact number in the West. There I had over 3,000 fighters ready, 2,500 to 3,000 in actual flying. That was in the West only. Question. Why were not more of the 30,000 fighters produced in 1944 put into operation? Answer. They all became operational as long as the lack of gasoline did not become noticeable. One of the main difficulties was the bad transport situation. It was impossible to take back the damaged aircraft, so that new aircraft had to be supplied. Towards the end, we were short of well-trained pilots as well. Question. Did you have many more planes than you were able to operate? Answer. If we consider the bombers, we had a lot more planes, but in the fighters, the losses were very heavy. Back in 1942, when an aircraft was forced down in a foreign country, it was just picked up or repaired on the spot, and came immediately back into circulation on its own. Later, this became impossible and the machine was lost forever. Towards the end, we were not in the position at all to undertake the repair of such machines. Question. Were the attacks on repair facilities and hangars at airfields important in defeating the Luftwaffe? Answer. I could not say that they were a major factor, but they naturally did contribute, as you can see when you look at the German airfields as they are today. Question. In other words, the wastage was so great in 1944 and 1945 that production could not keep up with it? Answer: the new pilots were much worse trained than the old ones, and the losses were considerably higher. Question: what were the causes of wastage? How does this amount of wastage in the air compare to the wastage on the ground? Answer: I would like to put it differently. After the last strong attack on England, which was made by 9th Corps and their bombers, this corps had to be withdrawn because of lack of aircraft. We had to ground all the bombers and reorient completely to fighters. As far as I can remember, 5 wings were affected by that. Thus, of course, those people needed a lot of aircraft for their retraining. Consequently, at the time the bombers were grounded and part of the fighters, which I would have normally given to the fighter squadrons as a very strong replacement, had to be used for retraining. But I would like to add that the situation would have generally changed if the war had continued, because in April, the Me-262 became the airplane which again could attack the bombers disregarding the enemy fighter cover. The manufacture of the 262 was supposed to be dispersed into subterranean workshops in Kala, which were to produce 1,000 complete aircraft per month. There was also a large factory near Kalfering, which had considerable concrete cover and was to produce another 1,000 planes per month, and we were building a tunnel at Garmisch. All that was for the 262, which already must have had a monthly production of 1,500 machines. This was then to be increased to 2,500 and 3,000. We have to consider further that jet planes did not need any high-quality gasoline, and that as hydrogen plants for this work had to be underground by autumn, we had decided to completely change the production to jet planes, even the bombers. The DO-335 had 2 props, 1 puller and 1 pusher type. I gave orders to retain the puller type propeller, but to replace the pusher type by a jet engine. In this way, we would have achieved what we were lacking most in the fight against the American airplanes, namely the long-range fighter. The FW-190 and Me-109 are, of course, comparatively short-range ships. Question: were substantial losses sustained in ferrying aircraft? Answer: sometimes, when, for instance, through bad luck a ferrying flight would hit the enemy planes, and very often we had to ferry aircraft under pressure during bad weather. Towards the end, we had some very bad weather in Germany. Question: did you lose much on account of machine flaws in ferrying? Answer: no. Question: on account of inexperience of pilots? Answer: especially through the inexperienced pilots, especially in fighters. During the ferrying of bombers, the ferrying losses were within bearable limits. Question: we have read that you have said that for every 4 aircraft lost in combat, about 40 would crash on the way home. What did you mean by that? Answer: that is the old song again. That statement was never meant that way. It was meant to refer to the ratio of combat to non-combat losses, and it was made at a time when we had the upper hand. The Americans were not in the war, and we were very strong in comparison to the English Air Force. Question: how do combat losses compare with losses by other causes? Answer: if you include in combat losses all losses in fights, both direct and indirect, they would be just about the same. Towards the end, the combat losses became larger. At the beginning, the total losses from other causes was, in my opinion, higher. The percentage of pilots lost per plane losses was changing. In case of a heavy-scale Allied penetration, we would lose through weather, enemy action, crash, etc. 40, 50, or 50% of the machines, and the pilots lost were 12 or 15%.